Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to the Equity Trustees Giving Review Launch 2020. I'm Jodie Kennedy and I'm joining you today from the gorgeous lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this beautiful place we call Sydney. And would like to pay my respects to its elders, both past, present and emerging. We're very honoured today to have a whole range of amazing sector partners, collaborators and influencers joining us on this webinar. However, to formally launch our event off, I'd like to share a brief message from the wonderfully passionate and insightful Carol Schwartz, who we're extremely grateful to have as the Chair at Equity Trustees.
Thanks so much, Jodie. Welcome everyone to this very exciting annual launch of the Giving Review 2020, which is Equity Trustees' third consecutive review. Now, I'm sad that I can't join you live today, but I'm really looking forward to doing so and being part of the Q&A this time next year. I'd like to start this session for everyone, though, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm residing today, which is the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And also welcome you all from around the country on your own traditional lands to this event. This is my first year as Chair of Equity Trustees, and one of the things that drew me to taking on this role was how aligned it was to my personal passion for philanthropy and how much I respect the Equity Trustees team and the work that they do here with and for our clients and the for-purpose sector. As a dedicated philanthropist and fierce advocate for a wide range of social issues that I have a particular interest in, I think it's really important that we have discussions like this, where we bring together a whole range of participants in social change. So whether a funder, a for-purpose organisation, or others connected to the sector, collaboration and the sharing of insights is absolutely crucial. It's been such a difficult year for everyone, and we need to work together if we're going to survive the next couple of years, whilst also building the sector back better and stronger. So while it's been a time of great disruption and even trauma, it's also been a year that's seen a rallying of the sector's spirit and collective energy like never before. And we, as a major funder of social impact, have a responsibility to share the knowledge, data, insights and learnings that we've seen and experienced with all of you. So please enjoy today's discussion. We hope it is useful and interesting. Ask lots of insightful questions and please feel free to send me your feedback on the Giving Review if you get the chance to read the full document. Thank you for your drive and commitment to social change. I'm really looking forward to continuing to support the Equity Trustees team to lead more effective, more innovative and more responsive philanthropy through the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome back, everyone. We're very excited to be launching our third Giving Review today. The most exciting part of this process being that we get to share the amazing examples of for-purpose organisations putting funding into practice that drives innovation, capacity building, and leading examples of achieving great social impact. So before the team and I introduce you to some of our very talented sector partners, I wanted to invite Ross Wyatt from Think Impact to join me for a quick comment around the importance of being able to measure impact, especially so in our role as a large-scale funder of around $100 million per annum. So Ross and his team have worked closely with us for the last 3 years to bring the expertise and support we needed to take us on this journey towards measuring our impact. So throughout the presentation, please don't forget to ask as many questions as you like through the chat function as we endeavour to share some of our learnings from 2020 with you. There is a little blue raised icon in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and you can put your questions in there at any stage. So Ross, our partnership with Think Impact started roughly 3 years ago when Equity Trustees decided to shift our focus from just the amount of money that we were giving across the country every year to actually looking at the effectiveness and the impact that we were achieving through our funding. So because we all know giving away money is actually relatively easy, but giving it away effectively is extremely challenging. So tell me in the words of an impact measurement specialist, why do you think it's important that funders like us should be taking an impact-led approach to our giving?
Hi, Jody. Look, well, for 240 years, I guess we've had a philanthropic sector that's been really focused on giving, but we're entering a really challenging phase in our country now. We think of ourselves as the lucky country, but really we've got 1 in 4 children in Australia living in relative poverty. Wealth and income inequity is high and increasing. Workforce casualisation is creating a whole set of struggles for people to have a dignified participation in the economy. Wages have stagnated for 20 years. The population in Australia is ageing. 1 in 3 Australians are now born overseas, and social cohesion is declining, and the environment's struggling, and climate change is only going to make that worse. So, it's really important that we move this focus from giving to actually investing in impact, because the legacy of investors is not going to be measured by the size of the checks that they write, but how they've shaped the future for the next generation. And look, we commend Equity's work in actually leading the way on this.
So Ross, thank you for that. Once we were all on board across the organisation as to the why, you and the team then started working together to map the areas of focus in which we actually have the discretion to drive and measure our social impact. And we started co-developing and building out our blueprint for deepening impact, and then our subsequent measurement framework. What did you see very early on was the challenge around Equity Trustees taking this approach when we have such a diverse granting portfolio?
Yeah, look, the challenges, the issues that you're addressing is complex, and one of the things that the temptation is when there's nearly $100 billion to invest. You try and solve everything, and I think the work that you did in actually resolving or coming down to 4 areas of focus was really important. But then even within those 4 areas, you've got to do the work to find out what levers can be pulled. The issues are complex. So how do you actually create the change that you want to create in those areas? And then you're turning those then into like criteria for granting, and that's no simple thing as well. And then, of course, the big challenge of aligning all the data collection that, you've got multiple activities working in these related areas. How do you actually align that data collection so that you're actually making progress on these big issues that you're trying to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, this is part of our blueprint, which is up on the screen right now. So why do you think it's important that Equity Trustees, as a leader in the philanthropic space, can demonstrate not only how we can grow philanthropy, but also strengthen and catalyse social impact?
Yeah, and I think, the key there is this idea of expanding your concept of what it means to be a steward of philanthropic money. And, this is the great work, I think, that stewardship now doesn't just mean careful management of the money and careful granting it, but it also makes sure that it also includes making sure that the philanthropists themselves are informed about the issues that they're granting in. So they've got the information and the understanding of how they're going to create change. And at the same time, that the organisations that are receiving that funding are able to then report and account for the impact that they're creating. And, the work that Equity's done in actually expanding this idea and reinventing what stewardship actually means, I think it's really important. And if we are going to change some of those dynamics we talked about earlier, then that's the way that we've got to actually shift from giving to investing in impact.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. Now, I want us to talk a little bit more about the importance of strengthening the for-purpose sector, and specifically these 4 approaches we're taking to drive greater effectiveness in the funding that we do. So we're going to move on to speaking to one of our grantees from 2020 and to hear how our commitment to convening and funding collaboration has proven to be an innovative and successful way in which to drive really great social outcomes. So I'd like to welcome my colleague Bryce Stevens and her guest, the lovely Larissa Baldwin, to share their insights on an incredible journey that's just come to fruition.
Welcome, Larissa. Convening and funding collaboration is a big focus and something we love to do at Equity, but it's so practical and it makes so much sense for all in the sector to be working together in a united way. Larissa, as the First Nations Justice Lead at GetUp, you live and breathe the work of relationship building. In the frame of collaboration, can you talk to us about the First Nations Self-Determination, Truth and Justice messaging project you're helping to lead?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd like to acknowledge I'm on Niagara and Turrbal country up here in Minjan or Brisbane. So we've been leading this project for almost 2 years. It started off with a fellowship with over 20 different First Nations communicators, from journalists to frontline service organisations, activist collectives. And this came out of seeing a lot of messaging research throughout the US and seeing how, particularly here in Australia, how effective the refugee sector was in changing the messaging around indefinite detention and how they were able to shift support into that. So we've seen that kind of work happening and really wanted to see within our spaces, how we could bring this work in. But knowing that there are many different First Nations advocates working across, and in order to do the work that we've done, kind of needing to review kind of the analysis of language that's out there. So the idea is like the methodology behind persuasive messages. You want messages that activate your base, that they then go out and speak those and repeat those and then persuade people who are in the middle. And you also want the messages to alienate the opposition. So people who are out there, kind of like the Andrew Bolts of the world, they're saying their messages, and when people hear theirs versus ours, they move away from them and they're persuaded to our message. So we did a big review, and we kind of know this anecdotally, that the messaging have on a lot of different First Nations issues, whether it's incarceration, whether it's housing, whether it's talking about inequity across our communities and health services, that the messaging around even closing the gap is not making it, it's not working. It's not resonating with the general public. Generally, the general public don't know kind of what's going on in our community. So when we did a lot of the language analysis, we brought all these communicators together, and it was pretty eye-opening to see like how much our language is within our opposition frame. It's framed within deficit, it's framed within statistics, and that's over the last 15, 20 years kind of the impact of things like the intervention, but also, broad scale negative, there's lots of negative things written about us in the mainstream media. So overwhelmingly the picture that people have of us isn't right. And our messages aren't persuasive, and they're in our opposition frame. We're no longer asking for what we want in a persuasive way. So it doesn't matter what issue you're working on. I feel like when we, it's really challenging to see that the work that you do, that you spend so much time in, isn't actually effective. And I feel like a lot of the people within the space that we've talked to, people have really gravitated to this work. So if we know what's wrong, then people are really on board and really excited to get in and fix it and learn more about the research that we've done.
Yeah, well, it's really complex work, Larissa, and it's been collaboratively. It's been a collaboratively funded project between Equity Trustees, the Oranges and Sardines Foundation, Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, the Beeson Foundation, Mana Whera and the Australian Communities Foundation. You've completed the first stage of the project. Congratulations. But there's obviously so much more work to do and presumably more funding required. Can you talk to us about why it is so important for funders to support and allow the time and space for complex initiatives such as this?
Yeah, I mean, it goes to this idea that what we have as First Nations advocates and activists and communities, and even within our leadership, is not working. It is a really complex undertaking for us to do, and it doesn't really fit within kind of this normal thing of people. When we were first trying to fund it, we were really excited that Equity came on board, because it kind of opened the door to a lot of other people jumping on board the project. Because before that, people understood the kind of realms and the niches and the pillars that they donated to within First Nations giving, and it didn't really fit any of those pools of money. But I think Equity took a chance on us, and through bringing the fellows together and then their stories, people were able to kind of resonate with all the different types of people that would benefit from this work. And I feel like throughout that collaboration, and people being able to speak on different issues, whether it was like the First Nations Disability Network, or different media and spaces like that, or whether it's, you know, climate justice organisations, people were able to see the complexity and the fact that there are lots of different First Nations groups and advocates that would benefit from this work, because the underlying message is that we kind of need to repeat the same messages, and so we need to build this foundation of persuasive messaging that we can all use. We would obviously love to go into more specific projects after this, but it's a good foundation for everyone to be able to use.
Yeah, great. It's definitely not a linear process, and it takes time. Thanks, Larissa, for those insights. We are now going to move on to our next funding approach, which we refer to as unlocking sector potential, or more simply, supporting for-purpose organisations to learn, innovate and grow in order to be more effective in delivering their mission. And I'll invite my colleague, Emily Cormack, and her guest, Julia Keedy, up next.
Thank you, Bri and Larissa. I'm delighted to be here with Julia Keedy, the CEO and founder of the X Factor Collective. Now, we know the impact of the global pandemic has been felt acutely in the social sector. We've seen the entire for-purpose sector impacted in a way that we could not have imagined this time last year. As a funder, we know that we have a role to play in unlocking sector potential by strengthening the capacity of the sector through its funding of organisational learning, innovation, and ensuring that the sector is heard, supported and valued for its life-changing work, and even more so in a global pandemic. So the X Factor Collective that Julia founded is a social enterprise with a mission to reduce burnout and improve wellbeing in social change makers. And this year you've managed to create and run the Reset 2020 national program and the National Impact and Need Research Study, with the goal of capturing real-time data from the sector about the impact of COVID. You were then able to rapidly curate some live programming for the sector based on these survey results. Welcome, Julia. Could you please share with us why you saw the need for the first survey, and what was the data telling about the impact of COVID on the sector, and then how your live shows linked to that data? Julia, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Thanks, Emily, very much. It's wonderful to be here. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Oh, great. And it's been wonderful working so closely with the Equity Trustees team this year. Unlocking sector potential just seems like such a great description for the Reset 2020 project on so many levels. It has been probably one of the most collaborative projects across the social purpose sector this year, with well over 25 peak bodies involved as outreach partners. So it's been a real privilege to lead it, but it's certainly very much owned by the sector we see at the moment. So just to set the scene, Reset 2020 as a project was a response to COVID, and it very much emerged around the sort of 24 hours after the Australian Grand Prix was cancelled. And that was a real moment and a signal that things would not be normal for a very long time, seeing those big domino effect of those events being cancelled. And that our people in our sector would be very hard hit, that small organisations would miss out on being able to access support and advice during this once-in-a-lifetime experience, and also that everyone would also be too busy supporting their beneficiaries to be able to find the stories of hope and transformation that we knew would happen in our sector, because we are very creative and innovative. And so the programming was kind of born from that imperative, and it's very much core to our mission and our expertise at the collective. The research aspect emerged from wanting to ensure that we'd be basing the programming on actual impacts and actual need, and thus the National Impact Plus Need research study was created. At that time, in validating the need for the project, many organisations such as Philanthropy Australia, FRRR, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and even our charity regulator, the ACNC, all jumped on board as outreach partners, as they could see the far-reaching impact of the data if we could capture it quickly and at intervals. So Equity Trustees, I guess, quick response to Fund Reset 2020, back in March when things were starting to really fall apart, has been recognised as really inspired and impactful philanthropy for the sector this year. So while we were getting the first survey out the door in April in world record-breaking time, we started the programming firstly to address some of the big ticket items related to income and fundraising, and then also look at people and wellbeing, and just tapping into that rich expertise that we have in the collective. And we're able to quickly pull together 12 organisations as well, large and small, who could share their experience and their advice. And that was a real lifesaver for organisations. A couple of those were Guide Dogs Australia, who were one of the first organisations in March to pivot to online events, and they just were really open and sharing. Swinburne University, despite being a very big institution, they were able to show how they went ahead with a COVID-specific fundraising appeal, which was really helpful for small organisations. And that was at a time when boards were cutting fundraising budgets and fundraising appeals. And other organisations like Crohn's and Colitis Australia, a health organisation where we had the CEO and the chair come on for a live show and talk really openly about their experience of cutting their operating budget by 40%. So in total, there was about 36 talent over 12 live shows. And the first wave of research, just three quick insights, was very much validated what was being seen and predicted in the sector. And of note, financial reserves were showing that 45% of organisations had reserves of 6 months or less. 70% of organisations had stood down volunteers, and nearly 1/3 were already starting to see the impacts on employee wellbeing and mental health.
Wow, that is quite impressive to pull together so many relevant live shows during the restrictions of lockdown across the country, and then also some very significant and difficult stats to grapple with. You released a follow-up survey, which was a pulse check in August, and we've just seen the results from this in the last couple of weeks. Could you please share with us the findings and your understanding of how the sector is faring now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Emily. The second interval ran the same questions again, but we also had the time to increase the questions around wellbeing and mental health. And again, very core to our mission and direction with the collective as well. And overall, the biggest concern now is really about our people and the high levels of burnout. We've just finished a few weeks of media interviews, and it's interesting because very few mainstream media actually understand that our sector is larger than the tourism and hospitality sectors, and that's largely because we don't really advocate for ourselves as a sector, because like Ross spoke about earlier, there's so many issues that we are grappling with as a society, and we're often advocating for the beneficiaries and the people being impacted by those issues. So for us as a sector, for 1.2 million people that work here every day, the standout really is wellbeing now, and that's the 2021 focus, that we should be monitoring that really closely. Some of the findings just in that last pulse check, since July, a turnaround, a significant increase in demand for services since July. Another difference were that staff were working much longer hours than compared to the first survey. So that was up from 18% in April, May to 38% in September when we asked again. Access to resources, a quarter of volunteers over that period of time in September were not available due to caring responsibilities or illness. So even when organisations did need to call on their volunteers, they weren't there. And that was presenting a significant challenge for a lot of organisations. We also saw, in terms of revenue loss, coming back to that Grand Prix point, was 50% of revenue loss was from community events and fundraising. Also some rural and regional differences were coming through. Some rural organisations have lost up to 75% of their income, and many not able to access JobKeeper or the cash flow boost as well. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the wellbeing data specifically, and thanks to Jody and your team for including in the Giving Review a really great graphic, which is the first lot of sort of wellbeing indicators that we have and that we can track and monitor now as a community and as a sector. So we were able to ask people to rate themselves across 7 indicators, which are all the indicators of burnout, and how they were feeling pre-pandemic and how they're feeling now. So there's some really interesting findings there around the burnout that we're seeing.
That's great. And I know that we're going to have an opportunity to share that data with people who participated today. We have run out of time, Julia, so I'm going to have to end it there, and we'll have hopefully time at the end for some questions if anyone has follow-up questions. But I'm now going to hand over to my colleague and the head of the granting team, Grant Hooper, and his guest Marlene, to outline our third funding approach, which is funding to empower equity. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Julia. It's probably an opportune time to also remind our audience today that if you do have any questions, I believe should be able to see a blue hand up to the right-hand side of your screen. So if you've got any questions, you can type those in and we can start thinking about them, and we'll certainly try and answer them towards the end of the session today. Moving on, Marlene, you're the co-chair and director of Every Age Counts, which is a multi-year, multifaceted campaign aimed at addressing ageism and its profound but not always obvious effects on all of us. At Equity Trustees, the notion of empowering equity is about ensuring that those impacted by proposed solutions are central to the design and implementation of those solutions. I guess we don't always think about our older generations as being excluded or lacking power. Certainly the youngest of our older generations, the boomers, have actually come in for a lot of criticism for all of the perceived advantages that they may have had over time. And in that context, can you explain to us the Every Age Counts campaign and why pursuing equity for older Australians is so important?
Thank you, Grant, and thanks again for the opportunity to join you today. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So in response to your question, Grant, let me start by defining ageism. Ageism is stereotyping, discrimination and mistreatment based solely on age, and it comes from negative attitudes and beliefs about what it means to get and to be older. Every Age Counts is a long-term national coalition-led campaign to end ageism and to positively change social norms about this phase of life. And we express our deep thanks to Equity and the Wicking Trust for supporting us in this work. Now, there are 2 features of ageism that I'm going to pick up in response to your question. Firstly, that older people and this phase of life is of lesser value, and the subsequent experience of exclusion and marginalisation. And secondly, the assumption that all older people are the same. So let's talk about the first impact of ageism. When we started this work, we started with 2 simple questions. How do you feel about getting older? What words do you associate with being older? And apart from the wall of negativity that came our way, not entirely, one of the recurring features of the response was older people feeling marginalised, excluded, invisible, of little worth or value. There was a recurring theme of an experience of exclusion, powerlessness, irrelevant at best, a burden at worst. Secondly, one of the most pernicious impacts of ageism is that it assumes we are all the same. We're all no good with technology, we're all frail and so on. But our starting principle for Every Age Counts is diversity, and it needs to be made explicit because so often we're cast as one homogenous clump, the elderlies, the boomers. We're cast as living a privileged life and hogging all the real estate. Now, for some of us, this may be true, but the reality is that older people, including boomers, are a heterogeneous lot. Great diversity on gender, race, culture, language, socioeconomic status, health, education, and so on. And accordingly, there are huge power and advantage differentials at this age. But the one thing all older people do have in common is the existence of ageism. It is pervasive and highly tolerated, and the impact of ageism is significant for older people. But for those who experience other forms of disadvantage or marginalisation, when ageism is added, the impact can be devastating to health, well-being, confidence and quality of life.
Thanks, Marlene. I guess at times the public conversation about what we call empowering equity has been treated as a zero-sum game. For example, seeking to address employment discrimination for older people has been framed as taking away opportunities for younger people and vice versa. And we've seen similar in some of the discussion about aged care and the issues with the pandemic. How's Every Age Counts seeking to avoid creating a conflict with other generations in your pursuit of equity for and addressing ageism against our older Australians?
Thank you, Grant. Yes, we've all seen the zero-sum games of intergenerational conflict invoked. But what research here and overseas repeatedly shows is that most people do not hold antagonistic views about other age groups. Yes, some of us may think that those others act and think differently, but when it comes to the personal, we deeply care about each other across the generations. Most of the conflict is about equity, not about age. So the key to the Every Age Counts message is that the fight against ageism is not a zero-sum game. We want equity and fairness at every age and stage of life. Our vision is a society where every person is valued, connected, and respected regardless of their age or health. We want current and future generations to age well, and that means addressing ageism. This is not an us and them. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not differences between us or in what is needed at each age and stage. If we're lucky, we will all get to age and move through each part of a life course. Older age is one of those stages, and it is as valid, valuable, and important as any other. But there is this widespread belief that this is an inferior, valueless, burdensome phase of life that does not deserve respect or dignity. And this is deeply damaging, not only for older people, but for our social cohesion as well. So going back to the employment example you raised, Grant, this divisive rhetoric that older people take away opportunities from younger people in terms of jobs is just not borne out by the evidence. This is about growing our economy for everyone, not swapping players in and out. And there's also terrific evidence that multi-generational workforces are functional, productive, and good for business.
Terrific. Thanks, Marlene. I look forward to continuing the conversation later. But now I'd like to handball to my colleague, Grant Mundell. He's an investment specialist by trade, and he's going to talk with Sabina from Impact Investing Australia about our next funding approach, which is funding for impact. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Grant. As an investment specialist, I need to be able to confidently provide a range of investment options to clients interested in both strong financial returns and positive social or environmental impact. There is increasing excitement about impact investing in the sector and the opportunity it presents to invest in initiatives that seek both a financial as well as a social or environmental benefit. However, we know that there are many challenges that the for-purpose sector organisations face and that other organisations don't. Frequently, charities and social enterprises have a great program with proven impact, but many are not of a scale or standard suitable to attract mainstream investment. Through our discussions in the sector, we know how difficult it can be for charities and social enterprises to access capital for growth. This is why Equity Trustees is supporting Impact Investing Australia to deliver the Department of Social Services Sector Readiness Fund Growth Grants program. This sits within our funding for impact focus because we believe that for the sector to reach its potential, we need to ensure charities and social enterprises have access to funding that is appropriate for their age and stage. It's great to be joined by Sabina Curutolo, who's the Director, Public Policy and Social Enterprise at Impact Investing Australia, and to talk a little bit more about the Sector Readiness Funds Grants program. Welcome, Sabina.
Thank you.
Sabina, just wondering if you could discuss a little bit about some of the challenges that the for-purpose sector faces accessing capital and how the Sector Readiness Funds Growth Grants program helps.
Yes, thank you, Grant. So as you mentioned, the challenges faced by the for-purpose enterprise sector have much in common with the challenges faced by enterprises elsewhere in the innovation ecosystem. And then in addition, they also tackle the social and environmental issues that is at their heart. So they need to be able to access appropriate capital for their stage of development, but also on the appropriate terms. They may need to bridge funding and capacity gaps to be able to attract investment. And so our growth grant aims to solve three market gaps. The first is that many impact-driven organisations in their growth stage may have sustainable and replicable business models and the potential to secure investment. But these organisations often need professional advisory support to get investment ready and engage with investors, but they struggle to find such advice and to fund such advice. The second gap is that an increasingly large number of professional advisors want to support and work with these mission-driven organisations, but the fees available for these capacity builders are currently insufficient, and they make it difficult to support a business model focused on working with these for-purpose organisations. And finally, a growing number of investors want to invest in direct deals that have a positive impact on society and also generate a financial return. So there remains a lack of high quality and values aligned investable impact deals in Australia. And this is where our growth grant comes in. We provide grants of up to $140,000 to mission-driven organisations to pay for these capacity building support that they need to raise capital and fast-track their growth and to scale impact. And on average, we see capital raised at a leverage of 20 times the size of the grant.
Great. And could you talk a bit about why it's important to build the sector's capacity to raising capital and scaling impact? And when we talk about capacity building, what do we actually mean?
Sure. So we talk about impact intermediaries as capacity builders, and they play an important role in matching demand for capital with supply. The range of services that they offer can range from financial modelling and preparation of the investment case, preparation of term sheets, legal documentation and information memorandums, as well as reviewing the organisation's constitution and legal structuring. And finally, liaison with and introduction to investors. So a recent example is Energy Renaissance. They're an Australian enterprise which design, manufactures and sells lithium-ion batteries which are optimised for hot climates using industry-leading technology and homegrown intellectual property. With their commitment to local manufacturing and local materials, Energy Renaissance will also create thousands of indirect jobs and direct jobs where they are most needed. So Energy Renaissance was awarded a growth grant last year, and they've subsequently raised $4 million, enabling them to grow their business and scale both their social and environmental impacts. They used the growth grant, to support their capital raising through strategic advice, which included financial modelling, risk, market analysis, and ultimately to support them in negotiating and securing the funding.
Right. Thanks very much, Sabina. We'd now like to mix it up a little bit and hear from a client of ours who's actually a practicing next-gen philanthropist and no doubt the successor of her family structured giving vehicle, along with one of my colleagues, Denise Cheng.
So today we've heard from some incredible voices from the for-purpose sector, but we also actually wanted to give you a bit of insight into how 2020 has impacted our active philanthropists. So our families that are giving in their lifetime, but often beyond that. At Equity, we have the privilege of working with over 250 individuals and families across Australia to give with thought and purpose. This year, our priority has been to keep our philanthropists informed and to help our philanthropists navigate through the complexities of giving in 2020, through the summer bushfires as well as COVID-19. Pleasingly, we saw about 22% of our active philanthropists reposition their giving to be more flexible and include COVID-19 projects as well as disaster response. About 73% made absolutely no change to their year-on-year giving, which in itself we weren't actually unhappy about or surprised. It reflects what we're seeing in the philanthropic sector, that donors in 2020 were really doubling down on their existing beneficiaries and assisting them to deliver on their purpose through crisis. But when we were doing the number crunching for the 2020 annual giving review, one of the things we found was that about 80 of our families have actually started involving their next generation in their giving, which is incredible. I'm absolutely honoured to introduce to you one of my clients and one of this next generation. And Caitlin, you've really taken an interest in your family's philanthropy this year, and as the nominated successor of your family sub-fund, I wanted to ask you, how have you found giving and the experience of giving in 2020?
Thanks, Denise. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I felt it was actually quite a lot more comfortable than I thought it would be. I felt that, surprisingly, in 2020, I feel like I just got so much more involved, and I think, Denise, you really encouraged me to get more involved. And I think with the year that was 2020, it was such an uncharted territory, and obviously a lot more has been done online. And I think that you really helped guide me through the process. So it definitely felt quite a comfortable experience considering everything.
Amazing. And what has been the impact of 2020 on giving? What's changed? What's been different?
Surprisingly, I thought that obviously with, the bushfires, COVID, and everything else that happened in 2020, I thought that it would be a lot. I can understand that it might have possibly been very overwhelming and confusing, and I genuinely think that probably would have been the case if we didn't do, I think it was last year we went through with Equity Trustees, we did a bit of a strategic process, and we looked into kind of like our profiles and what giving meant to us as a family, but also individually. And I truly think that helped us to feel less confused, less overwhelmed. And it was kind of that vehicle that really helped lay the foundation for the direction that we decided to take in 2020. And I know that you mentioned the statistics. So we actually decided to stick with our original strategy, which was to support women, because we figured that, obviously everything that's happened in 2020 is so tragic, and there's been truly devastating things that have been happening. People have lost their lives to COVID, but I think, there's always going to be something. And, when we think about how many women, there's just as many women still being diagnosed with breast cancer and losing the battle. So we kind of thought that was still something that we should follow through with. I think that, I got more involved. I was chatting to you a lot, and we were chatting to the shortlisted beneficiaries. And I think the key questions that kept coming up was which project is in which project is in greatest need, and where and who needs the funds the most. So it meant more to me when I felt like, we got to interact quite a lot, you and I, with the researchers. And I just felt that you allowed me and you encouraged me to ask more questions and to be more specific and more involved. So I really appreciate that.
Fantastic. No, it's been a great journey this year, and seeing you get involved has been fantastic. So just to wrap up, what's a piece of advice you might want to share with all of our for-purpose charities that are on the line right now?
I think that I feel like, to me, and I don't know about you, but I think connection is so important. And I felt so honoured and privileged to be welcomed into the National Breast Cancer Foundation with open arms, and at the real beginning stages of creating such a wonderful relationship. And they're really allowing me to get further involved outside of just donating money, with the help of Equity Trustees and the support of you, Denise. I just think, connection is so important. And I think at the end of the day, taking time to create and encourage loyalty and really nurturing relationships and allowing donors to really get involved in other ways if they wish to, I think is so important to building that long-term relationship and really making a difference in the future. So that's one piece of advice I would give.
Fantastic. Thanks, Caitlin, and really appreciate you adding your unique perspective today to today's event and philanthropic giving in 2020. And now I think it's time for Q&A. So I'm going to hand back over to Grant Hooper, and he will coordinate our Q&A session.
Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Caitlin. Personally, I've really enjoyed each of these discussions, and I know that we've really only scratched the surface of each. As Denise said, we've now got, we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So please, we've had some come through, and please keep popping them through as things come to mind while we're answering other questions. And look, the first question I'd like to touch on or respond to comes from Isabel. Isabel, if I can just read the question, it says, it goes without saying that measuring outcomes and collecting data is essential to understanding the impact project. Do you fund the costs of measuring impact, capacity growing, cost of data protection? The challenge for many NFPs is measuring and providing this data to funders while carrying out their programs. It's a really great question, and I might kick off, and if anyone wants to jump in, please let me know. But look, measuring and evaluation, for our sense, can take many forms, but finding the form that is right for the type of initiative you're delivering is absolutely the first and critical part. And we think that's actually something that for-purpose organisations need to be undertaking and investing in. And where we're funding an initiative, we're absolutely happy to contribute to that cost as appropriate. We'd see that as a core element of our responsibility as a funder. And in fact, you know, as part of it, it's actually helping contribute to us building our own impact measurement frameworks. As we fund in each of these spaces, we've got ideas about the things where we're trying to shift the dial. What we want to understand is how individual organisations we're funding are going to track that to inform us about what are the right measures, what are the measures that the sector is already using or wants to use, and that should be guiding us as a funder. So that's the first thing on that. We have in the past also provided some funding to SIMNA, which is the Social Impact Measurement Network of Australia, to help build the capacity of the sector as a whole in this space. And certainly when we're talking with other funders, we certainly encourage this idea of funding the measurement and evaluation piece, not as a tick the box exercise and not as an exercise to drive, you know, to further that power imbalance that sometimes exists between funders and those doing the work, but actually to support all of us in this, to get a better understanding of what makes a difference. And that's really where it's critically important. And I remember in the early days talking with Ross when we were talking about going down this path, when Ross was describing to us and asking us to think about what does it mean to have impact. And it's really about asking the question, how will you know? How will you know you're making a difference? So it does. Sometimes that's something quite quantitative, and sometimes it's qualitative and much easier to capture. I don't know, did anybody else want to add to that? I can see most of your faces. Jody, you look like you had something to add.
No, I just was thinking what a great answer was.
Sorry, thank you.
Grant, I might just cut in 1 second. Yeah, look, one of the things that we're really finding now is this kind of journey and the focus on measuring impact is really important, and it's a great start. And what we're now starting to see, though, is how people are using that information and using that data to not just justify their existence, but to actually improve what they're doing. And now we're sort of starting to think a lot more in managing for better impact, because you can't kind of manage your impact. Your impact is a result of all the activities that you're doing, but how organisations can manage so they're producing better impact, and then know, and then report it back to you so that you can actually learn how you're shifting the dial on these big issues.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks. And look, what's really come to the fore for us is that understanding of this is an evolutionary process. You don't start out with all the answers. I don't think any of us assumed we would, but you don't start with all the answers. The more you sort of learn along the way about what makes a difference, the more you still realise you've got to learn. And particularly if 2020 taught us anything, it's certainly in that sense. You know, we're always learning and things change. Julia, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to try and wrap up for you in relation to the work of X Factor. So someone else here from Health Justice Australia, Tessa Boyd-Kane, who you may know, has asked about or suggested they've also been tracking burnout and wellbeing in their health and legal services, and particularly relating to the structures of work that lead to burnout, and wondering what you've seen through the survey, through the Reset 2020 survey, around organisations' preparedness to address this issue and where there might be more work to tackle this on a systemic basis. And there was also another question around how do we get decision makers, both government, philanthropy, and I guess in the for-purpose sector as well, to care about these findings?
Okay, I'll start with the first part from Tessa. I guess what surprised us was we actually asked in the research, first of all, we didn't know what the response was going to be, but we did ask, did the participants in the research see any correlation between our ways that we worked pre-pandemic and what was happening here now? And I think a lot of people have said that COVID has really just put a spotlight on some things that don't serve us well in the sector. So 80% said yes to those pre-existing constraints. And in the research there as well, and I encourage people to jump in and have a read and hear the voices, because people do talk about what they see as being those pre-existing constraints, those practices, those behaviours and the cultural space that we work within. And very much a lot of that coming back to this sense of the self-sacrifice that we make to work here in the sector as well, and putting a spotlight on that. So that systemic problem has certainly bubbled to the surface in our research, and love to share notes with you as well, Tessa, on what you're finding. Preparedness to address the issue. We certainly have a lot of examples in the research of what people have been doing this year at different stages in the two research, what they're doing to support their teams, to support themselves. And certainly that's coming through to the surface. We've noticed as well, just over the last 12, 18 months, that there's a lot more understanding of the impacts on frontline workers as well. You probably see this in your work as well, that sense of vicarious trauma. So the trauma that happens for people that are working on a front line and the impacts on their mental health and well-being. So I think we're going to see, hopefully, with all of the different data and the conversations now, that opportunity to hone in on the practices that do not serve us well. So I think that's really the work ahead for all of us, and that there is a genuine interest in making sure that we do that. The second part of the question is, Grant, was how do we get this data in front of some of the bigger decision makers? Is that the sense of that question?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So as I mentioned before as well, all of the outreach partners have been very much using this research at different tables that they're sitting around, and different decision-making tables as well. So, and we know that the Community Council of Australia have been watching our work very closely, the Charities Crisis Cabinet. David Crosby's been a great supporter of what we've been doing, especially the last couple of months, with the focus on wellbeing, and that is being fed into some of those conversations. The 2030 Charities Blueprint has a wellbeing pillar, and that's really encouraging, I think, for all of us to know that it's actually there with its own demarcation. And so now it's all for us to keep advocating for that data and for practices to be reviewed and challenged. It's also going into NCOS and VCOS and other groups like that as well. It's hoping that it's complementing as well some of the other data and research. We've also worked closely a little bit this year with Centre for Social Impact, Social Ventures Australia as well, who are conducting research and making sure as much as possible that the work is complementary. We didn't set out to be a research house at all, but here we are with, hopefully something of real value for the sector.
Terrific, thanks. And look, it's I think we've also seen some public reporting of the issue in the last few days as well amongst health workers, which hopefully elevates that conversation. Clearly there's responsibility for those running the organisations, but I think also those governing and funding those organisations to really be cognizant of this. And one of the criticisms, I suppose, of government and philanthropy at times has been that we haven't paid what it costs to do the work. And certainly looking after workers is part of that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely that human side of leading change. It feels like for a long time we've talked about our sector through economic indicators and not always the human and the wellbeing indicators, what it takes for human beings to actually get up every day and make the world a safer and more equitable place, really. So I think that's the opportunity now for us to actually keep that focus really tight.
Terrific. Thank you. Certainly there'll be plenty more that we'll see on this, I hope, over the next year or so as we try and, as they say, to quote that overused phrase, build back better. Look, we've still got quite a few questions and we're keen to answer them. I'm just conscious of time. It's about 5 to 12 or so. So we'll probably try and take one more question and then come back to Jody to say a few words. And then for those of you who need to leave at 12, by all means, please do so. But we might try and hang around, if that's okay with our panelists, for an extra 5 or 10 minutes to continue answering some questions just a bit beyond 12 o'clock. In that sense, then there are a number of questions, and one of them sort of relates to, to the impact of 2020, that we've had the bushfires and then COVID, and it's really forced a lot of short-term thinking, a lot of adaptive thinking, a lot of resilience in lots of ways. And there's a few questions related to that. One of them of us as a funder who's really trying to build out this impact-led approach, and what does it mean for us? But also then there's a question that I might in a moment throw to Ross to see if he wants to have a go at, is in relation to how do we kind of measure the long-term impacts of work done a long time before. And that part came from one of our biomedical researchers in the audience who's noted that the success of, I guess, driving towards these COVID vaccines has really been built on the work of years and years of basic research. Didn't know about COVID vaccines, but explored some really interesting, important questions. Ross, before you jump in to answer that second part, if I can just address the first part from our perspective as a funder, the impact of COVID, the impact of the bushfires can't be ignored. They don't change our focus or our desire to be an impact-led funder. They don't change the necessity for that from our perspective. By definition, impact is a long-term focus. What it does do for us, though, is sharpen up our focus about how best to achieve that impact in the short term. So it becomes a more tactical question. And certainly we've seen in the short term that the very survival of some of the organisations that are really critical to our strategy and really critical to solving some of the key issues that we're concerned with has come into question. And that's where we've sort of had to divert some of our attention, is to actually supporting those organisations in a different way. Sometimes that's been about allowing them to unlock funds that were already committed. So to divert them to a different, more urgent, more necessary purpose in the short term, whether that be about keeping staff employed, paying for extra safety or PPE, replacing work that would have otherwise been done by volunteers, or perhaps just covering off shortfalls that Julia referred to before in terms of fundraising and other things that occurred. So we've tried to be as flexible as possible, and will continue to be so in responding to that need, whilst key organisations are struggling in the short term or needing to find that short-term stopgap to help them through this difficult period. But the focus still remains on the long-term outcome. We're trying to support those organisations to achieve outcomes in the long term. Ross, do you mind if I throw to you now to address that question that I posed earlier?
Yeah, look, Paul raises a really important question, and I think there has been an obsession with this idea of attribution. You know, what is the impact of our program? Are we making a difference? And to be honest, it's very rare you see a program evaluation that doesn't detect a 10% increase in something or other, or but it doesn't address the systemic issues that are actually leading to that. So in fact, we've got too much of the work is going on that actually relies on people's misery for these organisations to keep existing. And it's a really strange dynamic, because if you solve the problems, there should be no need for some of these organisations, which would be a great thing. So more and more we're seeing and we think that impact should be measured from two ways. One is you look at the population, what we call the population impact, and knowing that you're contributing to that could be enough. And then the second part of it is maybe your program impact is part of it. And Marlene raised an interesting point before. She was talking about ageism, and it was fascinating. So if you take that practical example, you might know that the proportion of people in your program who, feel an increase in their control or dignity as a result of participation in their activity. But at the same time, you want to be looking at that background and going, well, what proportion of people are experiencing ageism? What does ageism look like systemically? How do we understand our systems from a perspective of ageism? How many people are included in the workforce? All of these kind of bigger issues should be wrapped around any kind of idea of program level impact. And the other thing I'll just quickly say is that a commitment to a long-term understanding of our progress as a nation that is measured on something other than GDP would be a really good, useful place to start.
It's probably a good place now for me to bring Jody back into the conversation. Jody, did you want to do a close, or I don't know how to phrase that if we're not sort of completely closing? But I'll throw to you anyway.
So, Grant, I'm conscious that some people probably have a hard finish. There are a number of questions we will come back to, so hang around on the call if you can. But for those of you who have to leave us, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us on this discussion to share our insights from 2020 on impact and for being part of our official Giving Review launch for 2020. So thank you to our wonderful panellists for sharing their experiences with us. As a funder, we see it as our role to listen to the sector and support and enable you to do your critically important work. So this has been an amazing year showing the collective energy and passion and just incredible commitment of the sector. And at Equity Trustees, the team and I have been really privileged to be part of that. So please enjoy reading our Giving Review when it comes to you this afternoon by email. It's filled with very inspiring stories, and we are always open to fantastic feedback. So just drop us a line, pick up the phone, let us know what you think. And really just to say, have a wonderful and very well-deserved break over Christmas. I'm sure if you're anything like us, you're absolutely exhausted. So have a wonderful break, and we will catch up with you in 2021. Thanks, Grant. Grant, if you wouldn't mind, I might actually jump in and answer a question, because I'm conscious Sarah Davies from Philanthropy Australia has asked a really great question, and it was one that, whilst you think about it regularly, you don't often actually articulate. And Sarah's question for everyone was, what are EQT's priorities in 2021? And really, I think, just off the top of my head, I think the theme for next year for Equity will be holding steady, Sarah. So obviously we are halfway through our funding year for FY21, which means we're already frantically funding plenty of amazing projects. And so what we really want to do in addition to that is just make sure that we are supporting those multi-year arrangements and projects and initiatives that we have in train. So as most of you will know, Equity prefers to fund over multiple years and for the long term. And so we really want to make sure that we are committed in an environment where we know there is going to be less funds to distribute to supporting those organisations who we are in existing relationships with. That doesn't mean that we won't also be looking to fund new organisations, and we will absolutely be having a COVID lens over everything that we do and granting as much as we can. We will be providing the flexibility that we know the sector needs, and I think the team and I really are understanding now what that needs to be, and Grant talked about it earlier. There's a critical role in us continuing to lead our philanthropy clients. So we're getting many questions around, how do I best distribute my money? And so we are there and on call to help either existing or new philanthropists who need assistance navigating, is it bushfires, natural disaster, is it COVID, or you know, like Caitlin, do we stick with our strategy that we already had in place? And finally, we are also really interested, we have a position, a very privileged position to influence, because we have such a large portfolio of trusts to fund from, and we are a large corporate entity. And so we really want to see innovation happening, and we are really interested in what is our part in that, and how can we help to influence positively the long-term sustainability of the sector, and how can we see the large-scale changes that the sector needs in order to navigate the next 3, 6, 10 years. So we are well and truly aware of our responsibilities, and after a quick break over Christmas, we will be coming back and making sure that we're doing everything we can to get through this next 12 to 18 month period, and just being there to support and do what we do best, which is funding.
Thanks, Jody. Thank you. I think it's a really great answer, and maybe if I can just add slightly to that with some of the discussions we've had as a team around some work initially, or it was an article initially written by Mei Hong out of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, around talking about different phases of funding in this pandemic, in starting around funding for survival and the role philanthropy has in that, then moving through a rebuilding phase, and then ultimately helping to fund for resilience. And you touched on each of those things. And I think that's, for us, is actually helping is really trying to build our capacity to understand where each organisation is at and what sort of support they need. And is it in the short term? Is an organisation still in that survival mode, or is it sort of moved past that crisis and now moving into a rebuild phase? And ultimately, we want to be having those long-term conversations about supporting the health of organisations, great organisations and sectors as a whole around that resilience piece, so that, as May termed it, build in some shock absorbers into the system, because we know that there will be future shocks in one way or another. And it's our responsibility as a funder, in part at least, to help great organisations and sectors as a whole be ready to deal with those. Thank you. As you said, we do still have a number of questions, and I wondered if I could throw to Sabina now. Sabina, we've had a question about impact investing and asking whether this is now a mainstream form of investment, or are we still some way off?
Thanks for the question. I wish I could answer yes wholeheartedly to this, but I think the better answer is not yet. I think we've absolutely seen growth in the market, as RIA's report showed this year. And for my own experience, you know, definitely the conversations have moved from us explaining that the 101s of what is impact investing to people accepting that and understanding, having basic at least understanding of the market and what's needed. But I think where I see hope as well is in movement in the governments, so at different jurisdictions. So at the state level, you know, we've seen terrific leadership from New South Wales through the social impact bonds, and then more recently here in Victoria through the social enterprise strategy and the social procurement framework that is associated with that. I think has incredible drive here within Victoria, and at Investing Australia we're also calling for that at the national level. And at the national level, the Social Impact Investment Task Force, I believe, has just submitted its report, and we're really keen to see what the recommendations are. If anyone's interested in seeing what our recommendations are, you can have a look at our budget submission. But certainly we think that to be able to get to impact investing to be a mainstream form of investment, I think what we really need is a catalytic impact investment wholesaler, and that's the flagship ask in our budget submission. And that's really calling on, you know, government to work with the private sector to co-fund a vehicle which will be a go-to place and really a catalytic source of funding that gets recycled and signals to the market that that impact investing has the opportunity to become mainstream. Thanks.
Thanks, Sabina. Can I just ask a quick follow-up? I mean, the sums of money you're talking about there potentially are quite significant. Do you see philanthropy having a role in that? You talked about the private sector and government.
Yeah.
Do you see philanthropy having a role?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, as I said, there's a suite of measures that we would look at really catalysing the market. And one of the, you know, we look to the global market for different examples. One of the examples that we've looked at is the Access Foundation, and that's really being able to provide that seed capital and the blended capital to enable the, you know, they talk about in impact investing that deals are made, not found, and so you really need that product coming through, and so you need that blended capital which philanthropy and loans can provide. So we are also looking at an associated vehicle that would sit side by side with an impact investment wholesaler. I think philanthropy has such an important role in supporting and testing and pioneering new models of delivering social and environmental outcomes. So yes, a very important role to play here.
Terrific, thank you. And just looking at the time, I think we've probably got time to squeeze in one more question. And I'm going to direct this one to Briar, who leads our animals and environment focus area. It comes from Esther Abram, Briar, who you know well. Her question is, given the tendency in 2020 for grant makers to knuckle down and support existing grantees, has Equity seen any trends around giving to the environment and climate change? Are donors more willing to consider their role here, particularly in light of the bushfires?
Thanks, Esther. No, great question. And yeah, when we're thinking about what the priorities are going into 2021, I think we all understand now that climate and the environment is one of the #1 concerns of all Australians, but even more so our young Australians. And so we are seeing climate and the environmental issues becoming a real area that families, especially in our intergenerational giving families, want to pursue. And so we are, like we've spoken about today, we have been knuckling down over this period, but at the beginning of the year, the bushfires absolutely marked an unprecedented level of giving from all Australians. And then COVID and the connection of our weather and our health impacts to the environment it seems like it's all coming together in a I don't want to say a perfect storm, but a real urgent storm. And so we are definitely hearing that come through as an area of giving need from our donors, Esther. And I think what we're also seeing is a blending of climate and the environment out of just a sort of a green space into the understanding that this affects everybody and all areas. It affects aging, it affects health, it affects our most vulnerable disadvantaged communities in Australia. And so we're seeing our donors putting these pieces all together and understanding that by funding these initiatives, whether it be in health or in other areas, they are supporting the environment. So open that up to anyone else on the panel to contribute. Ross has been doing a lot with me on bringing our animals and environment strategy together over the last 2 years. So yeah, jump in, Ross.
Look, I just quickly, I'd love to hear from other people as well, but yeah, there's a really good example in the animals environment team, because it's a relatively modest investment, and you go, well, how do you actually make a difference in such a big issue? And I think the choice that you've made to actually go, we can't solve every environmental issue out there, but what we can do is mobilise and invest in activities that mobilise young environmental leaders of the future. I think is a really smart, sensible, sound strategy to. That's how and you won't see the difference straight away, but the next generation is likely to experience some impact from that. So well done on that, Brian.
And Ross, you've touched on a really important point there in terms of philanthropy. Where we're lucky, philanthropy has the money, but we don't have all the answers. And so we've been really deliberate in our efforts in terms of crafting our strategy and our focus in each of these focus areas around engaging with people who are actually working in the space, who are leading organisations or leading efforts in each focus area, to ask them what are the key issues and what are going to be the solutions, and where can philanthropy invest to make the biggest difference. And then we've needed to then work with that around our own framework and what works for us, but we've very deliberately not gone in there with preconceived ideas about what the answer is, very much trying to co-design where possible and really listen to the experts and engage and invest in the solutions they're putting forward. And it's been really incredible when you get to engage with the leaders in their fields who can step above their own organisation and look at the whole space and look at the system and say, this is what we need as a system. This is how we need to respond to this question. And we're really excited, I guess, in each of these spaces to see how that's going to evolve over time in terms of the difference we can make with our investment and hopefully bringing others along with us in that way. Look, we are now close to 12:15, which is well over our scheduled finish time. We're all pretty passionate about this and could keep talking for hours, but I never like to stand between people and their lunch. So to that end, again, I just want to echo Jodie's comments before around thanking our panellists for giving up their time today and in the lead up to this to help deliver this session. We've had lots of really great comments come through on the question feature complementing you and complementing the session. So thank you for your efforts. Really want to again thank everybody for tuning in and giving us this opportunity. Really look forward to sharing what we've found and what we continue to find and learn as we go. So thank you to everyone. Wish you well.
Thanks everyone. Have a lovely Christmas.